Okay, thanks Vienna, and thanks for the invitation. So I'm delighted to give a talk here and also to spend the semester, even if it was quite cold so far. So everybody told me it's unusual, but I start to have some doubts. Let's hope that it's getting warmer soon. Okay, so I'm going to talk about ruin theory. And as many of you are interested in applications to other fields, I will start with a short introduction. And we're going to see how to take into account correlation between risks in insurance, how to take into account some kind of claim size worsening. So what happens if climate change or sectorial inflation makes claims become worse and worse over time, in some sense. And then I'm going to conclude with some link between this theory, ruin theory, and sequential testing applied to a longevity risk problem. So longevity risk is the awful risk that everybody lives longer than expected. That sounds good from anybody's point of view, but of course for pension funds, for governments, for insurance companies, it could be a big issue. So we're going to see some application of ruin theory to some sequential testing problem applied to longevity risk. Okay, so the three parts of the talk corresponds to three papers. One with Hans-Jörg Albrecher and Corina Constantinescu from Lausanne and Liverpool. The second one with Dominique Korczak from Austria and Pierre Ribeiro from my department. And the last one about longevity, it's a work in progress with Nicole El-Karoui from Paris 6, Christian Maza from Fribourg in Switzerland, and Yahya Salih from my department. Okay, so I was supposed to make drawings on the board, but Gennady told me, don't do that because the board is not clean. So I was lazy and I had no time to use a LaTeX package to make proper slides. So I decided to do the drawing on my board and then to show them to you. So this is a typical picture in ruin theory. So here you have time, that I forgot to mention, time t. And then you represent the kind of surplus of the insurance company over time. Okay, so it's looked like a river dam process, but some kind of dual type of this. So you start with a capital buffer U that's supposed to be there to deal with some extreme event that could occur. And then you have many policy holders. Okay, so those policy holders pay premium. And as a first approximation, you're going to replace the small and random upward jumps corresponding to the payments from the policyholders. You're going to replace this with a continuous and deterministic drift small c. Okay, so you get U plus CT, and then some old lady misses a signal. No gender jokes. Okay, so some person of any age misses the red signal, and you have to pay for the car and maybe the car of the other person. So this costs you X1, which is random. Okay, then you receive some more premium. Then something else occurs. I don't describe what it is. And then another one, and then this big claim makes you ruined. Okay, so because the surplus becomes negative. This is the picture you want to avoid with probability 99 point something %, but this is always the drawing that we make. We don't do the drawing where everything goes well. So you want the probability of this event to be small enough, typically, to make the business safe enough and to make policyholders safe enough. Of course, you could say, well, okay, let's take U very big, but you have some constraints on U, because if U is too large, as you this U is provided by investors. They want some return on their investment. So you're going to need some payments regarding the size of U. So you can't take U too large, otherwise it's too costly. And you can't take U too small, because otherwise it's not safe enough. So the question has always been in insurance, one question is how big should you be in order to make it safe enough and affordable enough for policyholders. Okay. So just to mention the last one thing, this zero level here, that's for convenience, but it's not necessarily the zero wealth level. Okay, it could be some kind of threshold after which, the supervisor will investigate and will make you stop some of your business, or it can be a threshold fixed by risk managers in order to keep it far away enough from the insolvency barrier. Okay. So we're going to investigate what happens when the XIs are no longer independent, because in the classical model, the starting model, the XK would be independent and identically distributed and independent from the claim arrival process. Okay. And so when you incorporate some correlation, then you can't use anymore, of course, the classical properties. So even the specialists from the field, like my colleague Claude Lefebvre from Belgium, you can see that he's very unhappy with this correlation. That makes him very sad. So Claude is a very important person, because he's the one who hired your colleague Pierre Paty in Brussels. Okay? And so you need more ingredients, and you can find these ingredients currently in Colorado, or also in Minorca in Europe. And you can see that now with these ingredients, Claude looks like. So, of course, not too many ingredients, otherwise bad things happen. Okay. So, the useful references in ruin theory, there are plenty of works that have been done, maybe too many of them, trying to generalize the classical model, okay, like incorporating investments, dividends, incorporating reinsurance, so risk transfer from insurers to reinsurers, incorporating some other mechanisms. So one good book, if you want to know more, it's this book, Ruin Probabilities. It's the second edition of the book by Søren Asmussen. And for this second edition, Hans-Jörg Galbrecher from Lausanne is co-author. Okay, so I start with an easy reminder. Okay, if I make the parameter of an exponential distribution random, and if I take, for example, this parameter to be gamma distributed, then the unconditional probability distribution that I get, the survival function, looks like a Pareto type survival function. Okay, this kind of survival function, I'm going to call it a Pareto type survival function throughout the talk. You can use other mixing distributions, and then you would get basically any type of completely monotone random variable. Okay, for example, you can get the Weibull distribution like that. So, how to try to generalize this classical model in which the xk are IID and independent from NT, trying to take into account some kind of correlation between the xk that can come in particular from some uncertainty on the distribution of the xk. So we're going to see this now. First, I recall some classical result from Lundberg and Kramer. The probability of ruin starting from U, so it's going to be denoted by psi of U. Okay, it's a probability that the process becomes negative. It's a constant times e to the minus RU, where R is the Kramer-Lundberg coefficient. If the net profit condition is satisfied, okay, the net profit condition is satisfied, it means that CT, what you receive during period 0t, is more than what you pay in average during this period. Okay, you need this for this process to go to plus infinity almost surely, thanks to the law of large numbers. Otherwise, you go down, and then ruin occurs with probability 1. I just showed the pictures to Pierre because he had missed. Okay, so if you don't take exponential claim amounts, but if you get light-tailed claim amounts, then you no longer have necessarily this equality, but you may have some equivalent. Okay, so psi of u is going to behave typically as c times e to the minus ru. This is one of the classical results of large deviation theory from the Scandinavian team in the beginning of the 20th century. And if you have some heavier tail, okay, so in insurance, for example, for hurricanes or for fire, industry fire risk, or for operational risk, very often it's more realistic not to use this type of distribution for claim sizes, but more Pareto type or heavy-tailed claim sizes. So for example, if claims are Pareto with parameter alpha, then instead of an exponential decay, you get a power decay. Okay, so psi of u is going to be equivalent to some k times u to the minus alpha plus 1, where minus alpha would be the regular variation index of u. Okay, so starting from this, how to take into account this correlation between risk and how to relax the IID assumption. When there is one first easy answer that's mathematically very simple that answers both questions. It's to say, okay, if I want to generalize from IID to correlated, the first step could be exchangeable. Okay, and going exchangeable for, you know that for an infinite sequence of random variables that are exchangeable, you know that there exists some random variable with respect to which claims are going to be conditionally independent. Okay, this is a theorem by De Finetti. So we're going to consider this conditionally independent model where theta is going to represent this kind of uncertainty we have, for example, on this exponential distribution. And then, as I told you, the first part is going to be very easy from a mathematical point of view, because to compute the ruin probability, we just have to integrate with respect to the distribution of theta. And for example, if theta is gamma distributed, then it's very easy to compute the ruin probability. Okay, so here you have one theta. That's, if you want to simulate, you would simulate one theta, and then you would use it for all claims to be simulated. Okay, and when you compute the unconditional ruin probability, you have two parts in the integral. The first part that corresponds to small values of theta. In that case, remember the expected value is 1 over theta. So if theta is too small, 1 over theta is too large, and then the net profit condition is violated, so that the conditional ruin probability is 1. And if the net profit condition is satisfied, then you get the classical equation. And so when you integrate, what you notice is that you get a positive limit as u goes to infinity, plus something that does not, a constant with respect to u, something that goes to 1 as u goes to infinity, and something that behaves like 1 over u. Okay, so you you've got psi of u minus capital A equivalent to B divided by u as u goes to infinity. Okay, and compared to the independent case, well, we have this additional term that's very concrete in practice, because when an insurance company opens a new line of business in a new country, very often they have no idea of the claim size distribution. And so you can't, if you're not able to adjust the premium over time, you're not going to be able to solve your problem by just having a large U. This is not enough. You must have also C large enough. And so the probability that C is not enough somehow, it's this probability that was missing in the first, in the classical approach. And then U is going to make you control the ruin probability if C is chosen large enough. So we could do this for theta that's not necessarily gamma, okay, in a conditional model where claims are conditionally independent and exponentially distributed. And we would get a similar result with two terms. This limit as u goes to infinity of the ruin probability, and an additional term that mixes net profit condition situations. One could also do this on the frequency of claims. So instead of working on claim sizes, you could work on the inter-arrival times. Okay? In the classical model, they were exponential and IID, okay, to get a Poisson process for the number of claims. You could make them exchangeable, and so in the same way. And the result is similar to what we had before, which is not surprising because there are strong links between the classical insurance model and the dual insurance model. And to go from one model to the other, so the river dam model, if you want, you have to permute the claim size and the inter-arrival times to get consistent results. So one interesting question is, what kind of correlation did we create between the claim sizes when doing this? Well, if I integrate this with respect to the distribution of theta, I would get the Laplace transform of theta as applied to x1 plus x2 plus xn, if I have n risk. Okay? And if I do it just for xk, I will have p of xk larger than xk equals the Laplace transform as applied to xk. So this means that I've got the joint survival function that's phi minus 1 as applied to phi of the p of x1 larger than x1 plus phi of p of x2 larger than x2 and so on, where phi is the inverse of the Laplace transform of theta. So this means that the correlation structure corresponds to a so-called survival Archimedean copula with generator the inverse Laplace transform of theta. Okay, and in the particular case where the claim sizes when theta is gamma, this corresponds to a classical model in which the correlation structure is survival Clayton, which is a particular copula that's particularly used in Europe by insurance companies to take into account dependence of extremes for large values on large values as a cautious way to approach risk aggregation. I want to mention this reference from André Dubé, who is professor in Lausanne. He worked in the end of the 70s on a model in which, this should be a 1 here, sorry, in which you somehow estimate as time goes by the frequency of claims in motor insurance, okay, and you refine instantaneously the premium you ask. Okay? So in our situation, in the previous situation I presented, we have no control on the premium. This occurs very often in practice in insurance, more often than what you think, because first of all, it may take quite a long time before we can get the data and analyze it, maybe 3-4 years. So then it's too late to take some decisions, and sometimes the only possible decision is to close the business. So this would correspond to ruin somehow, except that you wouldn't wait for your surplus to go down. You would say, okay, this is not profitable, I stop. Okay. Or another possibility is that the regulator doesn't let you put your premium too high, or that the market is too competitive, like in the United Kingdom, and due to comparison websites, and then you can't push your price up, otherwise you don't get any customers, or you get only the very bad customers due to adverse selection effects. But if you can adjust your premium, then, well, you can refine your estimate according to well, a bulk conditional expectation, or according to a classical Bayesian method. We call it credibility theory in insurance, but it's a basic Bayesian method. And then you can get, in that case, exact forms or approximations for the ruin probability. And this model was used in practice to design and calibrate the Swiss bonus-malus system. Okay, so the bonus-malus system, I don't know if you have it in the US, not sure. Every time you have a claim, this increases automatically your premium, but according to a system that's organized at the state level. Okay, and this corresponds to a kind of Markov chain with many states, and if everything goes well, you go down, and if you're in the lower states, your premium is very small. And every time you have a claim, you go up in the states. Okay, and to make it Markov, you have to enlarge the space. You have to consider a 3-year period, because the history over 3 years will play some role. So it's a Markov chain with a kind of like 500 states. It's a huge state space if you assume that claims occur independently. So different setting, and it would be possible to run the same kind of analysis, okay, but letting the premium be adjusted as time goes by. And of course, in some cases, you would get much lower ruin probabilities if you're able to adjust the premium. But this is not always realistic in practice. Okay, so now I'm going to the second part of the talk. What happens if claims over time become, if the tail of the claim size distribution becomes heavier and heavier? So this is something that we can't really measure accurately. For example, for hurricane risk, there is a lot of debate. Some people think that hurricanes will be stronger and stronger potentially in some zones, but we're not really sure exactly how this will be or how this will occur. So this part, it's not at all statistical, it's more probability exercise to think about the impact of climate change type effects on ruin theory. So throughout the talk, we're going to assume that if a claim occurs at time t, the claim size survival function, okay, ft of x, will be, well, 1 plus x over dt to the power minus alpha t, okay, starting from a situation where dt at time 0 is small d, and alpha t is alpha 0. Okay, so you start from this Pareto type survival function, and then we're going to change this scaling parameter or this power, one of the two only at each time, to make claims worse and worse in such a way that the average claim size is an affine function of time. Okay, this is a choice. We start from a reference situation, and then we increase linearly in time the expected claim amount. Okay, and we do this by changing the scaling factor or changing this power in the Pareto type survival function.
Are there any identifiability issues? How do you know if the effect's from the P or the alpha?
Oh, so you mean if this is so what we do is we only either we keep D fixed and we change the alpha, or we keep the alpha fixed and we change the D. And what we want to do is to compare the two situations when we change the expected value in the same way. Is it worse to change the alpha or to change the D? Okay, this is what we want to check. But in practice, well, you know better than me that it's true that it's very hard to, in estimations, to see if the effect is more on one or the other parameter. And so in this model, well, if you don't update the premium, basically you're dead very, very fast, okay? So it only makes sense to look at the situation where you update the premium instantaneously and you maintain what is called the safety loading, rho, constant over time, okay? So for example, if rho is 10%, this means that instantaneously the premium income you ask is 110% of what you pay in average, okay? So of course this is a very questionable and strong assumption because I already told you that we don't know the effect of climate change, so we would need to know this to adjust, but this is what we considered in the paper. So of course here the premium income, the accumulated premium income, before it was U plus CT, it was affine in T. Now it's quadratic because the claim size and so the instantaneous premium rate is affine. Okay, so the two situations we consider. First, we let alpha t vary like this. Okay, so we start from some alpha 0 that's above 1. Remember that 1 corresponds to the limit of insurability, because if alpha is less than 1, you have infinite mean. And if alpha is larger than 1, you have a finite mean. Okay, so we start with alpha larger than 1. And if 1 is this level, we go like this. Okay, we tend to 1 without reaching it. And the other way to change the scaling factor is obvious, it's just an affine transformation. And so it's possible to analyze the asymptotics of the Ruin probability, so when U goes to infinity. There is no strong mathematical difficulty, it's just applying classical regular variation techniques, being very careful with the different steps of the computations. And what we get is that in the first case, so when we change the alpha, we get an equivalent that's a constant times 1 over the square root of U. And in the second case, we get, of course, an equivalent where we are going to find this alpha 0, okay, because the alpha doesn't change. So we get a power of U in which alpha 0 is involved. And what we see is that if alpha 0, so the starting value of alpha is strictly higher than 2, then for very, very large U, for very large U, this will penalize more the risk. And if alpha is smaller than 2, then this will have more impact. And it's quite hard to interpret it. The only interpretation I could think of is not really valid because it comes from the light tail case. Okay, so it's probably not relevant in that framework. But if you think of the way to adjust the premium income rate as a way to control the ruin probability, if you link it with some risk measure, in particular with the Escher transform, then what you see is that to control the ruin probability as a first approximation, the premium you ask, it would be the expected value of your claims plus a coefficient times the variance. And so that's interesting because in that case, this means somehow that if the variance going from an infinite variance, from a finite variance to an infinite variance, it should have a strong impact because normally you really go away from a space in which the ruin probability is somehow controlled by this at the first order average plus a multiplier times the variance. So maybe it explains this kind of threshold we observe, but again we must be very cautious because this is an interpretation from the light tail world, and here we're in a completely different world.
Could you say again how the alpha is varying in model 1?
So the alpha,
it's decreasing, right?
Yeah, it's decreasing. Okay, so it starts from alpha 0. It goes, maybe I can draw it here. This is 1, and it goes like
Is there any statistical evidence how it's actually changing?
no.
I was afraid of it.
No. No, this is why we wanted to have a look at the two situations. But it's also interesting because, for another reason, because in finance, there is what is called operational risk, so the risk that comes from IT failures, from fraud, from any problem in the business. And if you look at the papers from Paul Embrecht and his co-authors, the estimation of the alpha in that case, they have confidence intervals that would be 0.8, 1.2. And so it's not clear whether we're in the finite or the infinite mean case. Whereas for me, the answer, anyway, would come from some kind of truncation issue, like what Gennady and some of his co-authors considered. So it's more a problem of how far do you truncate, because then after you destroyed 1 million times the total value of wealth on Earth, there's nothing more to value to destroy. So the problem is that if you truncate too early, you will underestimate the tail risk, and you will have bad incentives for risk managers. So not easy to answer this question. To go on this infinite mean example, to finish with that, we notice that the mathematics we used could be used also to tackle a model in which claims are IID, okay, so there's no change anymore, but the alpha is less than 1, okay? So in my education in actual science, in that case, the net profit condition is violated anytime because you can't ask for an infinite price to the policyholders. And so the ruin probability is 1. But, of course, if you adjust the premium, this time not as the history, but if you make it grow fast enough, then it's possible to completely squeeze the risk in some corner. And so if you consider an accumulated premium income rate, P, that's now growing very fast, basically regularly varying with some, so here we have to put minus with the indices, but with some beta that's larger than 1 over alpha, then it's possible to make the ruin probability as small as one wants, even if the net profit condition is violated anytime. But of course, this is not a realistic way to do it in practice because, well, if you ask this premium as time goes by, after some time you will reach maybe the maximum acceptable premium by policyholders, and you would be out of business because nobody would insure their goods with you. So that this is more a theoretical result. Okay, so this was about 2 adaptations of the classical framework of ruin theory. And now we're going to see the link between this theory and sequential testing in order to consider some longevity change point detection problem. So how much time do I have, Gina?
20 minutes.
Okay, so that's perfect. So then we have time to see Claude Lefebvre once again to introduce the problem. So Claude, as I said, is the colleague who hired Pierre in Brussels, and is Belgian, and is approximately 60 years old. So if I look at the mortality table of Belgium for males, he has, in average, 19.35 years to live. Okay? But if he's rich, if he has some private pension on top of it, then it's not going to live 19 years, it's going to live, in average, 22 years. Yes?
Is this conditional on him already being 60 years old, or?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, of course. It's here. It's a residual life expectation. So that's given that you reached age 60. How many years in addition will you live? Of course. So this gives basically at that time an average death age of 79 years. But of course, at age 0, this number would be smaller. It would be more 75, okay, because you could die earlier than the age 60. But of course, longevity is improving, so that maybe when Claude was born, the life expectation was maybe 55 or 60, no, maybe 65, let's say, and it increased over time. So these numbers here take into account the improvements. Okay, so it's a prospective view, it's a forecast. Okay, so you can see that there's a difference of approximately 14% between a rich Belgian guy and an average Belgian guy for the number of years he's going to live after 60. And this would correspond to the difference regarding the total amount to be paid for pensions if you start retirement at age 60, okay, and if you don't have any interest rate. In practice, the random interest rate plays a very important role. Okay, so for those of you who do mass finance, there's a clear application field that's life insurance, because you combine some biometric population problems with some complex long-term finance issues. So what can Claude do to live longer? Well, he could change sex, because Belgian females, they live 23.76 years after age 60, which represents more than 4 years more. And what you can see is that if, in addition, this woman is rich, then she lives 25.83 years in average. You can see that the difference is smaller between rich women and the average woman than for males. Okay? This is somehow because females have already experienced quite many improvements, while for males there is still more room for improvement, and this leads to more heterogeneity. But Claude, of course, it's a bit painful to change sex, at least I imagine, and maybe anyway he would not benefit from that. So Claude was smarter. He moved to Barcelona, and so if you look at the mortality table for Spain for males, it's only 1 more year for the average Spanish guy, okay, so 20.39 instead of 19.35. But if you're a rich Spanish guy, it's 26.56. So there's a huge difference, more than 30%, between the average Spanish guy and the rich Spanish guy, because inequalities are larger in Spain, unfortunately, and also access to healthcare and living conditions are much more different. And this will have some impact. So you can see that an insurer facing males and females in different countries with some selection effects, okay, because the guys who purchase extra private pensions, they are not the average guy. It's going to be quite hard, it's complex to do the forecast. Why? Because the insured populations are small, so you don't have enough data to estimate everything only with your own data set. You must work with relational methods, so you must use the Bureau of Census, or in France it's the INSEE, or the relevant bureau data, and you must try to find some kind of relation between the mortality of your group with the mortality of the national population or the reference population. And this link can be very different in different cases, and it can change also over time very much. So that's a problem. And if you're a pension fund or an insurance company, and if you want to hedge your risk, so to transfer longevity risk, you can try to go to a reinsurer, but this is limited because the reinsurer has limited capacity. Or you can try to go to financial markets, so to ask JP Morgan or any other financial institution. The problem is that JP Morgan or the other investors, I don't have any stock of JP Morgan, but JP Morgan was one of the companies that were very much involved at the beginning of the longevity risk analysis. If you go to those companies, they're going to be very reluctant to buy some kind of financial products, some kind of longevity derivatives, whose payoffs would be based on the actual mortality of your pension fund or of your insurance company, because they would fear asymmetry of information. They would be more comfortable, or let's say less uneasy, with national populations, because then they would think that the game is fair. And that's what happened in practice. There is no standardized market for longevity risk, but there are many private deals between pension funds and banks or financial institutions. And very often, these risk transfers are based on the mortality of the national population. And so what is the residual risk for the pension fund or for the insurance company? The residual risk is what is called basis risk. It's a risk that the longevity of your pension fund increases faster than expected, but the longevity of the national population does not increase as fast. So that you have to pay more and you're not really compensated by your partial risk transfer strategy. So what we wanted to investigate was how to detect fast enough some change in the link between the mortality of two populations, one being smaller than the other, okay, and without, of course, having too many false alarms. And this is, in fact, similar to a well-known problem of sequential testing that was considered by the Russian school many years ago. Okay, they observed some kind of Brownian motion on their radar, and if they observed this, this would mean, okay, the US sent us some nuclear missile, okay, so we want to react, if this occurred at that time, theta, we want to react at this time, tau, fast enough, okay, to try to destroy the missiles and to send other missiles on the way back. And so somehow you're interested in reacting fast enough, so you want this to be small enough in average, and you want also the probability of false alarm to be small enough, okay, because you don't want to create a nuclear war just because of a large excursion of the Brownian motion, okay, that causes your radar to have some long excursion. So this problem has been investigated by Shirayev and by many other authors. In the case of Brownian motion, and at the beginning, through a Bayesian setting, okay, so with some prior distribution for this random instance theta. And what we considered in our paper is, so we still have this change point theta, but we won't place any conditional distribution on theta, okay? We're going to try to do not too bad in the worst case scenario, okay? So we want to be good enough, whatever theta is going to be. So the framework is we have some kind of baseline intensity. The lambda T0 would be the mortality intensity for the national population, let's say. And the lambda T is going to be the mortality intensity for our population, for the pension fund or the insurance company or the region population. And it's going to be rho underlined times lambda 0t before theta, and it's going to jump to rho bar after theta. Okay, so maybe this is not completely realistic because it's a change like that. Maybe we should consider some change like that. Okay, but we started with this framework. Okay, so without loss of generality, we can start with rho bar equal 1, and this is not without loss of generality. This is different. So, and we can let at the beginning rho bar be larger than 1. This corresponds to the case that's the hardest to solve. I'm going to explain why soon. This is the case where you're afraid that the mortality of your pension fund becomes higher than the one of the national population, or than the forecast through the national population. So this is not longevity risk, it's mortality risk. Okay? But we can do the same analysis with rho bar less than 1. This would be, or this was our initial motivation. And in that case, it's going to be easier because some function is going to be continuous at some point. I'm going to show you in a few minutes. So what kind of optimality criteria are we going to consider? So very often people consider the time elapsed between change and detection. And what we consider is more the number of deaths between the time, the change point time, and the detection time. Okay, so this is the difference between the number of deaths, because this will have more impact than the time itself. But in practice, it changes some technical things, but many computations will look the same thanks to some kind of martingale methods. And we want to control the frequency of false alarm. Okay, so the frequency of false alarm, we measure it through E infinity of n tau. Okay, so the probability P infinity corresponds to the case where the change point occurs at time plus infinity. So this is the case where it never changes. Okay, so when it doesn't change, we want the number of deaths before we trigger the false alarm. We want this to be large enough. Okay, so we're going to impose it to be large enough. So the problem that we consider is a kind of optimal stopping problem. Okay, we want to find the stopping time, tau star, for which this quantity is the smallest, subject to the fact that the false alarm constraint is satisfied. And so we want to consider the worst case in terms of theta. Okay, and we consider, I forgot here the essential supremum in the LaTeX file, of well, the conditional expectation of this number of deaths between change point and detection time, okay, given the observations we have. And we make a strong assumption. This assumption is that n infinity is plus infinity almost surely in both, under both P infinity and P0. This means that we have an open population. Okay, and this is questionable because many pension funds are closed to new entries. Okay, in particular, several pension funds have been closed during the subprime crisis. So our results are valid for an open population problem, which is the case for many pension regimes in France and in some countries of Europe, but it would need to be adapted for closed pension fund setting. And now we're ready to see the connection between this sequential testing problem and longevity problem, because we're still trying to prove, even if normally this morning we finally succeeded, but it's too late to be sure that it's not going to become false again and hopefully true again. But at this time of the day, we have the proof again, because we used to have it, then there was a problem. So what we proved is that, so far, is that the optimal strategy is indeed given by this picture. It's to consider this optimal stopping time, tau m, that's very simple to implement in practice. You have some level m, that's a detection barrier, and you're going to consider what is called the CUSUM process. That's, it looks like the risk process that I defined earlier, okay, except that it's reflected at 0. okay? And it's not exactly the same picture. You would have to do like me and see it. Okay, maybe I help you because it's better to do it like this. So if you take m minus vt, okay, you find again the same situation. Okay, so positive drift, claims, and this feature that I mentioned earlier very briefly, the dividend barrier. Okay, when you reach some level, you give the dividend to shareholders. So, and then detection corresponds to ruin. And it's a very particular case of ruin theory because the claim sizes in our problem are deterministic and constant over time. So that it's possible to compute, in that case, the expected number of jumps up to the first time where you cross this. It's going to involve exponentials and polynomials. So it's a bit tedious, but it's easy formulas. And why is that? Because if you look at the log likelihood ratio, so sorry, the t should be there. Well, if you look at the log likelihood ratio between the two probabilities, the one before the change and the one after the change, okay, then this log likelihood ratio looks like log of rho times nt. Remember, rho is the multiplier that changes the mortality intensity, okay, times nt, plus, well, this would be a constant time t if lambda was constant over time, okay? So as rho in our setting is larger than 1, this corresponds to upward jumps, and this corresponds to negative drift, okay? And of course, it would be the opposite if we had rho less than 1, so when we are interested in the longevity problem. And what happens in that case? Well, if I look at the problem where, so this should still be, sorry, it should be VT0. Okay, I made a mistake in my nice LaTeX graph. So what happens there? If rho is less than 1, then you still have the reflection in 0, but this reflection is done by cutting the jumps, okay? So you go up, you have downward jumps, and so when you reach the barrier m, it's much easier because you cross barrier m continuously, okay? And so if you look at functions like starting from some position, the average number of additional jumps before the first time you get above m, okay, this type of function is going to be continuous at m. Because as you get closer to m, okay, the probability to have one jump, it's going to go to 0, okay, and so you're going to go continuously in this function from m minus to m. Whereas in the case where rho is larger than 1, the technical problem we have, and that we're currently solving, is the fact that you have this overshoot. You have this overshoot, and because you have this overshoot, when you go from a level that's below m to m, then you get some jump that's going to occur. So this jump is compensated by the martingale that we define. But the problem is that when you go down, then something else happens, because here, when you're above m, you don't need any jump, okay? You don't need any jump to reach to a level above m, because you're already there. But as soon as you cross, you will need at least one jump, okay? So the expected number of jumps up to the next time where you're going to cross the one, it's strictly more than one. Okay, so you've got a jump in your functions that you need to compensate. Okay, and so how to compensate them when you have somehow to count the number of down crossings of this barrier and to add the term that's going to compensate these down crossings. And this is where we had some difficulties, and this problem you can find it in some books that have been published, but this problem is not correctly studied, and some assertions are indeed false because of this jump problem. So it's a bit more technical, but as long as you compensate those jumps, it seems that you're able to prove that the QSUM is optimal. And this, the fact that this QSUM is optimal, many researchers have proved it in different settings that could be Bayesian or non-Bayesian, like Bayraktar, Pour, Dyanik, and other researchers. Okay, so I will stop here. Thank you.
Gerald, thank you, Stefan. Let's go. Any questions, comments? How easy is it to get away from the Poisson arrival assumption?
In that problem?
Yeah.
Ooh. This wouldn't be very easy because we make heavy use of some kind of memoryless property in the proof. So, in fact, we haven't really considered this problem. We haven't thought of this problem. We have thought of different problems, like multi-sensor, so having different observation, different sets of information. We have thought of two-sided problems, so you don't know whether rho is going to be less than 1 or larger than 1. So for those problems, we can hope to get similar results. Another generality, so how to go away from the Poisson, I could be very, I could cheat and tell you can go to the compound Poisson setting. Because in practice, for insurance companies, it's not the same if Bill Gates dies or if any of us dies, except if there is many rich guy in the room that I don't know. Because, of course, the amount of money to be paid is not the same for Bill Gates and for the average guy. And so, if you look at the aggregate pensions to be paid or some change, this will take into account both deaths, but also the amount. And in that case, the jumps would be of random size if you assume that you have a large population. So this, we are pretty sure that it works, that it can be extended, except that we wouldn't get anymore this this explicit closed form formulas for this expected number of jumps up to. So we would have to use simulations, but it's an easy simulation problem to choose the M such that we have this false alarm constraint.
Any other questions? Okay, let's thank Stefan again.